Hello my beautiful little Moglets. Today we are doing a beginner's guide to gear. The things you should look out for, what's important, what's not important. I don't think I've ever done a gear guide actually, so I thought, yeah, sure, let's do it. It won't really be structured like a typical guide. It's more of just like a thought piece. But I am going to try and give as much advice as I can. So to really make it a beginner's guide, we're going to start with the basics. Stats. What do they mean? Attack is the amount of damage you're going to be doing. Defense mitigates damage. More defense you have, the less damage you'll take from an attack, unless it's defense penetrating, of course. Health, when you run out of that, you die. Speed, the more you have, the faster you'll be, and what that means in a turn-based game is if you have more than the enemy, you will go before them. And when we're talking multiple turns, then combat readiness comes into play, but basically more speed means your character will get to act more often. Crit chance is your chance to crit. Crit damage is the damage of that crit. Effectiveness is your chance to land a debuff. For example, in Dizzy's case, on her third skill, she can decrease speed, attack, and hit chance, but only if her effectiveness is high enough to override the enemy's effect resistance, which is your chance to not receive a debuff. So even though Dizzy here has a 100% chance to land these 3 debuffs, the enemies can still resist through effect resistance, so to break through their effect resistance, you need to have a lot of effectiveness. And then dual attack chance, pretty self-explanatory, so that's the basics of stats. We also have right and left hand side gear. Let's start with the left hand side, your weapon, your helmet, and your armor. On these 3 pieces of gear, your main stat, shown bigger and in bold, will never change. This is always going to be attack, this is always going to be health, and this is always going to be defense. It will also always have flat stats, meaning not percentage based. On the right hand side, you have your necklace, your ring, and your boots. These gears can vary wildly in what their main stat is. For example, we have attack percent on the necklace, but if we go look at our other necklaces, we have crit damage here, flat health here, health percentage here, critical hit chance, defense percent. You get the idea. So the main stat on the right hand gear can be very different. Some right hand gear can have stats that other right hand gear can't. For example, boots are the only piece of gear out of all 6 that can have speed as a main stat. The ring is the only piece of gear that can have effectiveness as the main stat. I believe effect resistance as well is exclusive to the ring, and critical hit chance and damage is exclusive to the necklace. So what does that all mean? Well, if you need those stats, speed, effectiveness or effect resistance, or critical hit chance and critical hit damage, that's the best place to get those stats. However, and this brings us nicely into substats. If you want to maximize the effectiveness of your character, you want to pay attention to substats as well. This isn't as important super early on, but later on when you really want to start upping your character's potential, you're going to need to take those into consideration. It's far easier to get good substats on the left-hand gear because the main stat's always going to be the same. So with that said, substats are the most important thing on left-hand gear, whereas the main stats on the right hand gear are the most important, because again, these can vary wildly. And once you get the main stat you want, especially because these can be percentage based, unlike the left hand gear, then it'll do much more for you than going for like a flat attack piece with good substats. So in summary, pay more attention to the substats on the left side gear and more attention to the main stats on the right hand gear. Since there are no special substats, ones that you won't find on main stat accessories, for example, we don't really need to go too much into that. Just know that percent-based stats, such as this 8% attack here, is always going to be better than a flat number. Like you see here with defense, it is 15, not 15%. Make sure to watch out for that. A small thing to note is that with speed, there are no percentage-based substats. The set does in fact give 25%, but nowhere else do you get percentage-based speed, so don't worry if you get flat speed, that's all you actually can get. As for everything else, it really comes down to the individual character. For example, my Dizzy here, I wanted her with a lot of effectiveness, so she gets those debuffs, so naturally on my sword I have a lot of effectiveness there. On the helmet, I have a decent amount as well, and on the chest, also a good amount of effectiveness. If we go over here to the accessories, you can see there are some mixed things going around. We got some crit damage in there, some speed, however I did want her to be fast as well, so speed's always good. You know, we got 22 crit damage here, which isn't that great because she only has 34% crit rate, so you don't want a lot of crit damage with low crit rate. It doesn't make much sense, you know? And you know, we got some crit chance and crit damage here, but again, I was focused more on the main stat up here, 40 speed, 60 attack, 60 attack. Another thing to talk about are the quality of gears. As you can see, we have gray, green, blue, purple, and red. The only difference between the colors are the amount of substats they start with. As you can see, this level 0 blue boot starts with 2 substats, this purple level 0 boot starts with 3 substats, and the red level 0 boot starts with 4 substats. As you level up gear, only the substats shown will get increased. Every piece of gear will eventually have 4 substats, but depending on the color, they will get that 4th substat earlier or later. And in the case of red gear, they never get any extra stats because they start with 4. In the case of purple gear, they'll get their 4th stat at plus 12. And since gray gear starts with 0 substats, you only just get new stats all the time. The obvious benefit with starting with purple or red gear is that at levels 3, 6, and 9, you get upgrades to your substats instead of just getting new ones. If you look in the top left of each gear, you can see a number. Here we have a 38, here we have a 44, up here we have some 85s, and this number is much more important for right-hand gear, the boot, the ring, and the necklace, than it is for left-hand gear. This is because this number determines the strength of the main stat as well as the strength of the substats. Substat strength can vary wildly, so it doesn't matter as much for the substats, but a lot for the main stat. So taking a look at this 85 boot, we can see it starts with 12% health. To get the final value, what it would be at plus 15, you times this value by 5, and we get 60% health. Now taking a look at this 70 purple boot, you can see it starts with 10% health, thus the max at plus 15 would only be 50%. The same is true for rings and necklaces as well. So you want to get the highest number possible on the right hand gear. Again, for left hand gear, it doesn't matter as much because it's flat anyway. This plus 15 85 sword gives 300 and this plus 15 71 gives 265. So yes, the main stat is impacted still, of course, but again, since it's only flat attack, it's not as big of a deal. So if you get good substats on a 71, take them over bad substats on an 85. Next, we can talk about set bonuses. So there are several different sets, actually more so than substats themselves. For the most part, they're self-explanatory. You know, speed set gives you more speed, hit set gives you more effectiveness, etc, etc. There are some special sets like the immunity sets, which grants you 1 turn of immunity at the start of a battle. A lot of people prefer that for PvP, but basically all I have to say about that is get sets when it's possible. It's basically free stats you're leaving on the table if you go with a broken set. However, I should say if you can get more stats with a broken set via substats, then that's totally okay to go that route as well. Substats can be very powerful, and if you have to give up a good piece of gear with good substats to make a set, and then that piece of gear that finished the set has really bad substats, then it might actually be better to give up the set and go with the really good substat gear. However, in general, it is recommended to utilize sets. So I hope there isn't something super important I'm missing with what gear does and what you should be looking out for. Obviously, again, it's going to depend on which character. Like a damage dealer like Luna obviously wants attack, crit chance, crit damage. If she has a skill, which she does, that plants a debuff, such as decreased defense, you want to put some effectiveness on there as well if it's your priority to make sure that defense down lands. A more bruiser type like Ravi, where she's meant to tank and deal damage, you know, you want a good mixture. You want some attack, some health, crit chance and damage for the damage. Effectiveness, again, if she has any skills. She only has it on Devil Drive. Perhaps after her buff, effectiveness will be more important, but as it is now, she doesn't get to do Devil Drive often enough to invest a lot of effectiveness. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Not just with Ravi, but with units in general. For the most part, you want your healers to have the stats that's based off their heals. For example, Angelica here, you can see the amount recovered and the barrier strength are proportional to her max health, which means you want to try and get her with a lot of health. In my case, I also built her with some speed because I like everyone to be fast, more or less. And someone so vital to the team, as healers usually are, should be able to take action often, in my opinion. And then like pure tanks, of course, defense and HP, that's just what it is. Maybe effect resistance if you want to make sure they don't get debuffed. So yeah, that's pretty much the basics. Also, of course, what's important is how to get this gear in the first place. Well, there's this thing that I can't really show you anymore because I'm finished with it, but there is something they recently added called the Adventurer's Path, and there is some very, very good gear in there. Absolutely suitable for beginners. I've even considered raising some of it myself, even as a more end-game player. Besides that, on certain floors, there's also some very good gear. You know, starting on floor 32, we got a weapon, helmet, chest, boots, necklace, and ring. So that's already very good gear you can get pretty early on. And of course, later on, you're going to want to start doing hunts for gear. I personally prefer Wyvern because it's the place I can do, and also the sets are good. Critical, hit, speed sets. Those are useful for a wide variety of different heroes, especially the speed set, which is probably why a lot of the advice you see is to try and get Angelica as soon as you can, because she is very, very good for Wyvern. I guess preferably on your selective summons. Besides that, of course, there is some gear in Adventure, but I don't really want to get into that because I'm not very well versed in Adventure gear and what is actually usable. Probably in the later stages, I can imagine. Since we have Adventure's Path, again, with its really good gear in there, that should get you started good enough to start going through Abyss, where you can start getting more of this lifesteal gear, plant that on your damage dealer. They should be good. Then maybe you can start crawling your way up through Wyvern 11, start doing some of that, get some gear. It's all good. I suppose just for the hell of it, we can also talk about what I consider to be perfect substats on gear, so you can maybe watch out for it. We're going to start with someone similar to Shermia that is a pure damage dealer. Their goal is purely to do damage, not to debuff or anything like that. Attack, speed, crit chance, and crit damage instead of effect resistance would be my preferred substat layout. There are some substats that actually aren't available on some gear. I believe you can't get attack percent on the chest, but for the helmet it would be the same story, replacing health with crit damage and effectiveness with speed. For the chest, again, since we can't have attack percent on it, I would be a little bit hard pressed to decide between health or effect resistance. Personally, I like health more because it's just a black and white thing. It's 9% more health. With effect resistance, however, it doesn't make much sense unless you really build it up. And 5%, you know, it doesn't do much. Might give you a slightly higher chance, but then it's RNG, you know. So I'd probably just replace effect resistance with speed, and that would be perfect for me. Necklace is a little bit tricky because I guess one thing I actually forgot to mention is that you cannot have a substat the same as your main stat. So while a necklace can have a critical hit damage substat, it can't have it while it's also your main stat. So attack, speed, and crit rate would be my preferable substats for the necklace. With the fourth one, I guess not really caring about it. You're always going to want to have attack percent on the ring for a pure damage dealer, and then in that case you can't have attack percent in the substats, but crit chance, crit damage, and speed you can have. Fourth one again, doesn't really matter to me. Effectiveness is always nice for someone who can debuff. Shermia can do a little bit of a debuff on her first skill, so it's not totally wasted, but yeah. And I think it's quite debatable if speed or attack percent you would rather have on boots. It really comes down to the individual character and what you're going to use them for. Again, I just like my characters to not be super slow, so most of them have speed main stat boots. And in this case, it would be crit chance, crit damage, and attack. With the last one, again, not really caring, could be anything. So those would be my preferred substats for a damage dealer. Right hand side for a purely damage dealer, at least for a beginner, is probably more going to be a critical hit chance, because there's not much point of stacking a ton of critical hit damage if you can't get a good amount of crit chance from your substats. And most of the time beginners are going to struggle to do that. So it's okay if you want to go for a critical hit chance necklace so you can actually do some critical hits. Always attack ring. That's the only good offensive main stat for a ring. Some could argue effectiveness is also good for someone who can actually debuff. And then I would say for a beginner, it's also a toss-up of speed and attack percent. But if you have an amazing pair of boots with attack percent and no good speed boots, then feel free to put those on. So for a more supporty character like Lidica, where she does have a lot of debuffs going on, we got decreased speed, combat readiness reduction, decreased hit chance, decreased combat readiness reduction again here. She needs effectiveness for all that stuff. So of course I try and have effectiveness on as many things as I can. Of course her gear isn't super great right now. This isn't making a very good example. She has like no effectiveness anywhere except for the ring, but you know, she gets 60% there, so it's cool. What the hell have I done? And again, for someone like tanks, you know, you want them to have main stats of health. You know, I gave her speed, so 2 health and speed. Also, substats, effect resistance is really good if you get that high enough. You don't want your healers to get stunned or whatever. That can be pretty dangerous. And yeah, I think we actually already went over most of that. I still feel like there might be something important I'm forgetting to go over. I mean, you can also craft gear in the Sanctuary. Soon you'll also be able to craft accessories after this update dropping. Actually, I think that's like tomorrow. It's pretty soon. Pretty excited. In the Steel Workshop, you can craft gear, but I guess you knew about that already. Personally, I'm only going for boots here. Everything else is kind of expensive. And again, the weapon, chest piece, and helmet I don't think are important enough to craft here, just because you will get a lot of them along your way and you can choose just based on substats instead of on substats and main stats like you would have to do with boots. But yeah, okay, I guess that's all the discussion I want to talk about gear. If there's anything else you want to mention, throw it down in the comments below. I consider these videos to also be discussion starters, so for people that want more information, they can go down to the comments where the actual pros are. But yeah, also any thoughts, whatever, you can drop that down there as well. Leaving a like if you happen to enjoy is always greatly appreciated as well. Thanks, as always, for watching, and until next time.